He thought he was the predator, and I was the lost prey. He calculated every single move to humiliate me right in the hospital lobby in front of over 50 people. But he forgot one vital rule. In our medical world, you are never allowed to determine the final outcome before seeing the complete medical record, even when that exact file turns out to be the life sentence of your own ex-husband. Hello to all the wonderful listeners of Haley Revenge Stories. I want to take a brief moment to speak with you directly and sincerely. Unfortunately, our channel has recently been demonetized by YouTube, which means we no longer have the operating budget to keep things running. If you find yourself captivated by today's story, I kindly ask that you consider supporting us with a donation of just $1. That single dollar gives us the essential funds to pay our dedicated staff, helping them cover their living expenses so they can continue creating these stories to serve you. You can easily make a donation by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Thank you so much for your continuous support. Now let us begin. My name is Sienna Gray. I am the head of rehabilitation at Zenith Medical Group, a title that cost me a decade of sleepless nights and ultimately my marriage. It was a Tuesday evening, specifically hour 14 of a grueling 16-hour shift. The main hospital atrium was a vast cavern of polished marble and blinding fluorescent lights. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass panels, a relentless rain battered the city. The heavy drumming of the storm blended with the rhythmic mechanical beeps of heart monitors from the adjacent trauma bay and the distant synthesized voice of the overhead paging system. It created a suffocating atmosphere, a sterile purgatory where people came to either heal their broken bodies or hear the absolute worst news of their entire lives. The smell of harsh chemical antiseptics hung thick in the cold, conditioned air. I was crossing the lobby, a clipboard clutched to my chest, desperate for a cup of bitter black coffee, when my eyes caught him. Julian, my ex-husband. He stood near the crowded pharmacy waiting area, looking exactly as arrogant as the day he walked out the door of our shared home. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that screamed new money and misplaced confidence, his hair styled to absolute perfection despite the dreary weather outside. But he was not standing there alone. Clinging tightly to his left arm was Clara, the woman who had been my maid of honor, my closest confidant, my absolute best friend since college. And tugging impatiently at the hem of Clara's expensive designer trench coat was a toddler, a little boy who looked to be about 2 years old. This was Julian's perfect new life. The very family he loudly claimed I was biologically incapable of giving him. As if sensing the weight of my gaze, Julian turned. His eyes locked onto mine across the crowded room, and that familiar sickening smirk slowly stretched across his face. He did not politely nod or look away out of guilt or shame. Instead, he released Clara into the center of the lobby, marching directly into my path and dragging his new family with him. He wanted a public spectacle. He craved an audience. "Well, if it isn't Dr. Gray," Julian announced, his voice booming intentionally over the ambient, chaotic noise of the hospital. Several nurses and anxious waiting families immediately turned their heads to watch. "Still married to the hospital, I see. Still working yourself to the bone on 14-hour shifts because there is absolutely nothing waiting for you at home in that massive empty house." Clara looked down at the floor tiles, feigning a pathetic kind of sympathy, her cheeks flushed red. But Julian was practically vibrating with malicious glee. "Look at us, Sienna," he continued, gesturing broadly to the little boy who was now hiding timidly behind Clara's legs. "This is what a real family looks like. A home filled with actual life and a child. Not just clinical charts, medical journals, and a barren womb. You chose your precious career over being a real woman, and look where it finally got you. Alone, rapidly aging, and utterly empty." In the past, words like that would have completely shattered my soul. I would have crumbled under the crushing weight of his public humiliation, giving him the exact tearful reaction he desperately desired. But working in severe trauma rehabilitation teaches you something profound about human nature and emotional survival. You learn how to completely detach your feelings from the situation. I looked at Julian not as a wounded ex-wife, but purely as a seasoned medical professional evaluating a highly unstable patient. I clinically observed the slight nervous tremor in his jaw. I noted the drastic overcompensation in his excessively loud voice, the desperate need for external validation practically sweating from his pores. He was a textbook narcissist, starved of his primary emotional fuel. I did not flinch. I did not let a single tear form in my eyes. I simply stood my ground and stared back at him with absolute freezing indifference. My posture remained perfectly straight, my expression an unreadable blank slate. The silence stretched between us, thick, heavy, and deeply uncomfortable for everyone watching. Without my explosive reaction to feed on Julian's arrogant smirk began to visibly falter. His shoulders tensed. He wanted a hysterical, broken woman begging for answers, but I gave him nothing but the quiet, terrifying composure of a woman who had completely moved on. My silence was a mirror reflecting his pathetic attempt at cruelty right back at him, and he clearly did not like the image he saw. Just as his face began to flush with the deep frustration of a completely failed performance, the quiet hum of the hospital was interrupted. My personal cell phone buzzed aggressively against my hip inside my scrub pocket. Maintaining my perfectly calm demeanor, I broke eye contact with Julian for just a second to pull the device out and glance at the glowing screen. It was a direct text message from my private lawyer. The words displayed on the screen were short, but carried a sudden heavy weight. I am in the lower lobby right now. I need to see you immediately. There is an urgent matter regarding the divorce settlement from last year. I slipped my mobile device back into my scrub pocket and walked away from the grand atrium, leaving the agonizing spectacle behind without a single backward glance. I took the service elevator down to the basement level, my mind racing with a chaotic blend of clinical detachment and rising adrenaline. The hospital cafeteria was practically deserted at this hour, bathed in a dim, flickering fluorescent light that made the sterile beige walls look distinctly unwelcoming. My attorney David was already sitting at a secluded corner table. A thick manila folder rested ominously next to his untouched paper cup of black tea. The air surrounding him felt incredibly dense. Our previous consultations had always been strictly procedural, a standard division of shared assets and legal formalities. Tonight, however, the professional distance was completely eradicated. His posture was intensely rigid, his facial expression grim and unyielding. "Thank you for coming down so quickly, Sienna," David said, his voice hushed but vibrating with urgent energy. "I am acutely aware that you are in the middle of a grueling shift, but this simply could not wait until morning." I took a seat opposite him, the residual tension from my encounter upstairs still humming faintly in my veins. "What is it?" "David, has the final settlement been contested by his legal team?" He shook his head slowly, sliding the heavy overstuffed folder across the scratched laminate table. "Not contested. Completely unraveled. My firm has been conducting a deep forensic financial audit, something initially triggered by a glaring discrepancy I noticed in his final tax declaration from 2 years ago." Sienna, during the sworn divorce proceedings, Julian testified under penalty of perjury that his independent consulting firm was barely breaking even. "It was," I replied, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. "We had to refinance our primary residence just to keep his business operations afloat." David opened the folder, exposing thick stacks of highlighted bank statements, wire transfer logs, and out-of-state corporate registries. That was a meticulously orchestrated fiction. Julian has been systematically funneling massive amounts of money through a complex network of 3 separate shell companies. We are currently looking at hidden, untaxed liquid assets totaling roughly $800,000. My breath hitched sharply in my throat. $800,000. The words echoed in my mind, feeling entirely surreal and disconnected from the reality I knew. How on earth did he manage to conceal that much capital? How did the auditors miss it during the initial discovery? "Because he was extraordinarily careful for a very long time," David explained, tapping a specific heavily stamped printed document. "But absolute greed inevitably makes people careless. Recently, Julian applied for a massive commercial real estate loan to purchase a lucrative boutique building downtown. To secure that specific tier of capital, he had to prove extreme high liquidity to the private lenders. He accidentally submitted an unredacted financial portfolio that linked him directly to those hidden shell accounts. A senior financial investigator on my team flagged the matching tax identification numbers just yesterday. I stared blankly at the papers, the stark black ink detailing years of systemic calculated deceit. While I was pulling endless double shifts to pay our joint mortgage and fund my own agonizing fertility treatments, my husband was quietly amassing a secret fortune in the shadows, actively preparing the ground for his eventual exit. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. But as my brain struggled to process the financial shockwave, David reached into his leather briefcase one more time. His entire demeanor shifted from a sharp, aggressive financial litigator to something far more cautious and delicate. "There is another layer to this, Sienna," David said softly. His eyes filled with a strange mixture of pity and anger. "Something that moves far beyond hidden money. It concerns the personal biological narrative he repeatedly used to justify the dissolution of the marriage." I stiffened instantly, my medical instincts flaring. "You mean my supposed inability to give him a child?" David leaned forward, looking directly into my eyes. "When the two of you were undergoing intensive fertility consultations roughly 4 years ago, do you recall Julian ever completing his mandatory specialized screening, the Advanced Reproductive Endocrinology Panel?" My mind raced violently back to those miserable, desperate months. The endless daily hormone injections, the highly invasive physical procedures, the agonizing waiting periods that slowly destroyed my mental health. He did the initial basic analysis. I recalled my voice trembling slightly as the suppressed trauma surfaced. The clinic claimed the initial results were inconclusive due to a laboratory handling error. When they repeatedly asked him to come back for the comprehensive panel, he constantly fabricated excuses. He suddenly had a crucial business trip or an unavoidable client meeting. Eventually, my own diagnostic tests showed a minor, highly treatable hormonal imbalance. Julian immediately latched onto that single data point. He told everyone, our families, our mutual friends, that I was the fundamentally broken one. He made me feel entirely responsible. He made me believe my body was a barren, useless wasteland. David let out a heavy, frustrated sigh and placed a single faded piece of paper on top of the mountain of financial documents. It was a formal medical letterhead. Not from our shared fertility clinic, but from an entirely different private urology specialist located 2 towns over. The date printed clearly at the top was nearly 5 years old. It predated our intensive fertility treatments by a full 12 months. During the aggressive asset discovery phase this week, we subpoenaed his personal email servers to track the shell company communications, David explained. We found this document buried deep in a hidden archived folder. He scanned it for his own personal records and forgot to delete the digital footprint. I pulled the piece of paper toward me. As a doctor with over a decade of experience, it took me exactly 3 seconds to interpret the cold clinical terminology. Severe oligospermia combined with critical morphological abnormalities. A genetic, entirely irreversible condition. The medical conclusion at the bottom of the page was typed in bold, unmistakable letters stating unequivocally that natural conception was a statistical impossibility. It further noted that even the most advanced assisted reproductive technology available carried a successful conception rate of less than 2%. My heart slammed against my ribs. The sterile cafeteria around me seemed to tilt on its axis. I read the date again. 5 years ago. He knew, I whispered, the crushing, suffocating weight of the absolute truth pressing down on my chest. He knew before we even started trying. He knew before he let me inject my own body with hundreds of painful hormonal shots. He knew before he sat in our living room, weeping crocodile tears about how my biological failure was destroying his ultimate dream of fatherhood. He manufactured the entire narrative from day one, David confirmed, his voice laced with pure disgust. He used your minor hormonal issue as a convenient, cruel scapegoat to completely mask his own permanent biological reality. And then he used that exact same fabricated narrative to publicly justify abandoning you and the marriage, all while secretly taking $800,000 with him to start his new life. I sat there in absolute deafening silence. The fragmented pieces of the past 5 years snapped together in my mind. The aggressive defensiveness whenever the topic of his personal health was ever raised. The immediate cruel deflection of blame. Julian had not just left me for another woman. He had orchestrated a calculated psychological execution to preserve his own fragile, pathetic ego. But then, slicing through the anger and the betrayal, a cold, terrifying realization washed over me. An inconsistency so massive, so biologically impossible, that it felt like a physical blow to my stomach. If Julian was completely and irreversibly incapable of fathering a child, as this indisputable, verified medical record definitively proved, then who in the world was the biological father of the 2-year-old boy standing with him in the hospital lobby just 10 minutes ago? I returned to the rehabilitation floor to finish the remaining 2 hours of my shift, moving through the sterile, brightly lit corridors on pure muscle memory. My physical body was diligently checking patient vitals, adjusting intravenous drips, and writing detailed progress notes, but my conscious mind was entirely consumed by the medical document David had slid across the table. Julian was sterile. The man who had publicly berated my biology, who had made me endure countless invasive procedures, had known for 5 long years that his own genetic code was an absolute dead end. That single undeniable fact fundamentally altered the entire foundation of our past. I felt a strange, chilling sense of liberation replacing the heavy grief I had carried for over a year. He had not abandoned me because I was broken. He had fled because he was terrified of being exposed as a fraud. When I finally returned to my quiet, empty house just before midnight, I did not even attempt to go to sleep. Instead, I poured a glass of cold water, sat at my kitchen island, opened my laptop, and actively pulled up Clara's social media profiles. For over 12 months, I had strictly avoided looking at her digital footprint. It had simply been too agonizing to watch my former best friend parade my former husband and their miraculous baby across the internet. Tonight, however, the blinding veil of personal betrayal was completely lifted. I was no longer a wounded, discarded ex-wife scrolling through a timeline of heartbreak and jealousy. I was a highly trained diagnostic physician meticulously examining a very peculiar clinical case. I scrutinized the hundreds of carefully curated photographs with a cold, unforgiving eye. I went all the way back to the initial pregnancy announcement, which Clara had proudly posted exactly 3 months after Julian packed his bags and walked out of my house. According to the dramatic narrative they enthusiastically shared with our entire mutual social circle, Clara had experienced a difficult high-risk pregnancy and tragically delivered their son prematurely at exactly 32 weeks. I pulled up the archived photos from the hospital delivery room. A sudden sharp realization hit me like a physical blow. I leaned closer to the high-resolution screen, my eyes tracing the details. Any medical professional who has spent even a fraction of their time in a neonatal intensive care unit knows precisely what a premature infant looks like at 32 weeks gestation. They lack crucial subcutaneous fat. Their skin is nearly translucent, and they almost always require immediate aggressive respiratory support. The newborn resting peacefully in Clara's arms in that photograph was robust, plump, covered in healthy vernix, and exhibited the unmistakable muscle tone and fat distribution of a full-term 40-week infant. They had deliberately lied about the gestational timeline to hide the true date of conception, a date that fell squarely in the middle of my marriage long before Julian and Clara supposedly realized their tragic forbidden love for each other. But that glaring timeline inconsistency was only the first major fracture in their perfect facade. I moved forward through the digital album to the most recent photos studying the toddler's physical development. I zoomed in tightly on the little boy's face in a picture taken just 2 weeks ago. He had a very distinct, deep cleft chin and prominently attached earlobes. Julian had a perfectly smooth jawline and unattached earlobes, both of which are dominant genetic traits. Clara possessed the exact same dominant facial traits. Biologically speaking, the likelihood of two parents with those specific dominant physical features producing a child with those dual recessive traits was statistically microscopic. Combined with the absolute documented certainty of Julian's medical infertility, the entire picture suddenly snapped into perfect, terrifying focus. The child they were parading around was not Julian's biological son. The following afternoon, right in the middle of my lunch break, my personal cell phone rang. I did not recognize the scrambled out-of-state caller identification, but when I cautiously answered, the voice on the other end sent an immediate shockwave down my spine. "Sienna, please do not hang up on me," Clara pleaded, her voice reduced to a frantic, breathless whisper. All the arrogant, polished confidence she had proudly displayed in the hospital lobby just yesterday was completely eradicated. She sounded absolutely terrified, her breathing shallow and uneven. "I know I have absolutely no right to call you," she continued, her words stumbling over one another in a desperate rush. "But I have nowhere else to turn right now. I need to see you, just for 20 minutes. Please, Sienna, I am begging you." My first natural instinct was to terminate the call immediately. I owed this traitorous woman absolutely nothing. But the relentless clinical curiosity deeply embedded in my nature, combined with the explosive secrets I now held, demanded to see the final pieces of this psychological puzzle fall into place. I calmly agreed to meet her. We met an hour later at an isolated, largely abandoned public park on the dreary edge of the city limits. The bitter autumn wind was biting violently, tearing the dead brown leaves from the massive oak trees. I sat quietly on a freezing wooden bench, watching Clara approach from the empty gravel parking lot. The woman walking toward me was a jarring, horrific contrast to the perfectly styled trophy wife from the day before. Without the heavy professional makeup and the carefully curated designer lighting, the harsh, brutal reality of her daily life was painfully visible to the naked eye. She wore an oversized, faded gray sweater and dark, oversized sunglasses that could not hide the deeply bruised, exhausted hollows beneath her prominent cheekbones. Her posture was entirely defeated, her shoulders slumped forward under an invisible weight. She constantly looked nervously over her shoulder, violently flinching at the distant sound of a passing delivery truck. She did not look like a triumphant woman living a fairy tale romance with the man of her dreams. She looked exactly like a desperate hostage trapped entirely inside a golden cage of her own making. She sat down on the far edge of the freezing bench, deliberately leaving a wide, safe physical gap between us, and immediately began to aggressively wring her trembling hands. The wind howled across the desolate park, biting through my thin medical scrubs, but I barely registered the cold. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, my posture perfectly rigid, maintaining a calculated physical distance from the trembling woman beside me. Clara pulled her oversized sweater tighter around her frail shoulders. Her chest heaved with erratic, shallow breaths that signaled an impending panic attack. "He is completely terrifying me, Sienna," Clara whispered, her voice cracking under the immense strain. "He is not the man I thought he was. He is not the man you were married to." Something inside his brain simply snapped roughly 2 weeks ago. He stopped sleeping entirely. He paces the hardwood floors at 3 a.m, muttering to himself. If I ask him a simple question, he erupts into a violent rage. He threw a heavy glass vase against the kitchen wall just 48 hours ago because I asked him what was wrong. I observed her dilated pupils and the dark, bruised exhaustion painted across her face. My training as a physician demanded that I assess her vitals, perhaps suggest a safe house or a psychiatric intervention. But as a woman who had been systematically dismantled by the very person sitting next to me, I felt absolutely no obligation to offer comfort. I remained an impartial clinical observer, gathering critical data. People do not fundamentally change their entire personality overnight without a significant catalyst, I stated coldly, keeping my tone perfectly level and completely devoid of empathy. "What exactly did you discover, Clara?" Because I know you did not drag me out to this freezing park just to complain about marital discord." A sharp sob tore from her throat. She pressed her bruised hands violently against her face, rocking back and forth on the wooden slats of the bench. 3 days ago, he drank an entire bottle of expensive scotch and passed out on the leather sofa in his study, she confessed, the words spilling out in a rapid, frantic torrent. He forgot to lock his hidden wall safe. The heavy metal door was hanging wide open. I know I should not have looked, but I was so incredibly desperate to understand why he was acting like a monster. I reached inside and found a massive stack of financial documents. Bank statements from offshore accounts. Huge, unbelievable sums of money transferred through fake consulting companies. Hundreds of thousands of dollars he never told me about. I did not react. I already knew about the $800,000. I simply stared at her, waiting for the real confession. But the money was not the worst thing. Clara continued, her entire body shaking violently now. There was a locked leather briefcase at the bottom of the safe. He had left the tiny brass key on the desk. Inside the briefcase, there were medical files, old ones, and one very recent laboratory envelope from a private genetic testing facility located downtown. Before I could read the actual test results, I heard him groaning in his sleep. I panicked, shoved everything back inside, locked the safe, and ran upstairs to my bedroom. Ever since that night, he has been acting like a cornered animal. Yesterday, he practically dragged me out of the house. He forced me to dress up. He forced me to bring the baby to your hospital. He told me we had to put on a flawless public performance. He specifically wanted to find you. Before I could formulate a response to her pathetic display of victimhood, my cell phone vibrated violently in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and saw David's name flashing brightly across the screen. I held up a single index finger to Clara, silently demanding her absolute silence, and answered the call. "Sienna, I hope you are somewhere entirely private," David said, his usually measured voice practically buzzing with raw, unfiltered shock. "My private investigator just delivered the laboratory reports." "Go ahead, David," I replied evenly, my eyes firmly locked on Clara's terrified face. "When Julian orchestrated that little theatrical performance in your lobby yesterday, my investigator was already on site observing him for our financial audit," David explained. "When Julian violently threw his empty coffee cup into the cafeteria trash bin, he also threw away the plastic juice box his supposed son had been drinking from. My guy retrieved the discarded juice box and drove it straight to our contracted private laboratory. We paid a massive premium fee to rush a comparative genetic analysis against the DNA markers we legally pulled from Julian's 5-year-old fertility medical file." The freezing wind seemed to stop completely. The silence stretched tightly across the telephone line. "And the definitive result?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. 0%, David stated emphatically. "There is a 0% probability of biological relation. The child possesses entirely different genetic markers. Furthermore, my forensic accountants just traced a fresh, heavily disguised credit card transaction from exactly 2 weeks ago. Julian paid $2,000 to a highly discreet paternity clinic in the financial district. He already knows Sienna. He ordered his own secret test 14 days ago. He knows the boy is not his." I slowly lowered the phone, ending the call without saying goodbye. The scattered, chaotic puzzle pieces instantly snapped together, forming a picture so perfectly devastating I almost laughed out loud. I finally understood the profound psychological collapse Clara was describing. 2 weeks ago, Julian, the man who had abandoned his loyal wife under the cruel fabricated pretense of her infertility, the man who had stolen $800,000 to build a flawless new kingdom, had received his own genetic test results. He had discovered that his beautiful stolen trophy wife had played him for an absolute fool. Clara had engaged in an affair, gotten pregnant by another man, and pinned the child on Julian to secure a lavish, wealthy lifestyle. Julian's entire aggressive performance at the hospital yesterday had absolutely nothing to do with me. It was not a display of victory. It was a massive, desperate trauma response. He was suffering from a catastrophic narcissistic collapse. His empire of lies was burning to the ground around him, and in a pathetic attempt to regain control, he had tried to weaponize his fake family against me one last time before the inevitable explosion. He wanted to feel superior for just 5 more minutes before having to face the agonizing reality that he was raising another man's son. I looked at Clara. She was staring at me with wide, panicked eyes, completely unaware that I now possessed the one secret that could destroy her comfortable life forever. She expected me to scream to demand answers to punish her for stealing my husband. But as I sat there on the freezing bench, staring at the woman who had ruined her own life, a profound, undeniable sense of absolute peace washed over my entire soul. The heavy, suffocating burden of vengeance I had carried for over 12 months simply evaporated into the cold autumn air. I did not need to formulate a brilliant plan to destroy them. I did not need to ruin Julian's reputation or expose Clara's infidelity to the world. Their own massive, tangled web of toxic lies had already condemned them. They were completely trapped inside a hell of their own creation, securely locked in a miserable marriage built on stolen money, fake biology, and mutual hatred. "I am leaving now, Clara," I said quietly, standing up from the wooden bench and smoothing the wrinkles out of my medical scrubs. "Wait, please," she begged, reaching a trembling hand out toward my coat. "What should I do? You have to help me. You are a doctor. You know how to handle crises." I looked down at her outstretched hand, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical pity. "My only medical advice to you is to hire an exceptionally aggressive divorce attorney, and perhaps a very good bodyguard. Your husband's condition is terminal, and I have absolutely no interest in watching the final stages of the disease." I turned my back on her and walked away across the dead grass. I did not look over my shoulder. For the first time in over a year, I felt incredibly light. The war was already over, and I had won simply by surviving. 72 days after that freezing afternoon in the park, the heavy mahogany doors of the county courthouse swung open to admit a standing room-only crowd. The sheer scale of Julian's financial deceit had elevated what should have been a standard private post-divorce asset dispute into a highly publicized spectacle of civil fraud. The local legal community had caught wind of the $800,000 hidden in offshore shell companies, turning the hearing into the absolute center of attention for the gossip-hungry socialites of our city. I sat at the petitioner's table next to David, wearing a sharply tailored navy blue suit that felt like impenetrable armor. The sprawling courtroom was a massive cavern of polished oak, dark green leather, and towering windows that let in wide beams of blinding, crisp morning sunlight. It was a stark contrast to the dreary, rain-soaked hospital lobby where this nightmare had reignited. Behind me, the gallery pews were packed tight. I could feel the burning weight of dozens of pairs of eyes pressing into the back of my neck. Our former mutual friends, the same people who had sent me pitying text messages and avoided my gaze at dinner parties after Julian painted me as a barren, career-obsessed failure, were all sitting in the second and third rows. They had come expecting to see Julian finalize his legal victory. They had come to watch the wealthy, successful family man put his bitter ex-wife in her place one last time. Julian walked through the double doors at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, flanked by 2 highly expensive, severely dressed defense attorneys. He was wearing a charcoal gray 3-piece suit, projecting an aura of untouchable arrogance. Clara was noticeably absent. After our encounter in the park, she had seemingly vanished into the background, undoubtedly consulting the aggressive divorce counsel I had sarcastically recommended. Julian took his seat at the respondents' table, boldly turning his head to shoot a charismatic, reassuring smile at the gallery of our former friends. He was still desperately playing the role of the confident protagonist in his own completely fabricated movie. The Honorable Judge Eleanor Vance, a woman known for her absolute zero-tolerance policy regarding perjury and courtroom theatrics, took the bench precisely 3 minutes later. The heavy crack of her wooden gavel echoed like a gunshot, demanding immediate and absolute silence. The first 90 minutes of the hearing were a methodical surgical dismantling of Julian's entire financial empire. David stood before the judge, meticulously laying out the complex, undeniable paper trail. He did not raise his voice. He did not employ cheap theatrical tactics. He simply presented the bank wire transfers, the fake corporate registries, and the sworn tax documents side by side on the massive digital projector screen for the entire courtroom to see. He systematically proved that while Julian was claiming near bankruptcy during our original divorce proceedings, forcing me to take on punishing 14-hour medical shifts to cover our shared debts, he was actually funneling massive sums of money into secret accounts. When David projected the final undeniable proof of the $800,000 hidden within the commercial real estate application, a collective sharp gasp rippled through the gallery behind me. I watched out of the corner of my eye as Julian's primary defense attorney furiously whispered into his ear, clearly realizing that their entire defense strategy was completely disintegrating. Julian's arrogant posture began to subtly crack. His jaw clenched tightly, and the charming smile he had flashed earlier completely melted away, replaced by a deep, dark flush of panic creeping up his neck. But the hidden money was merely the prelude to the true execution. Judge Vance adjusted her reading glasses and stared down at Julian with a look of pure, unadulterated legal disgust. She addressed David, asking if the petitioner had any further evidence regarding the respondent's character and history of sworn perjury. David walked calmly back to our table and picked up a single standard manila folder. The air inside the sprawling courtroom suddenly grew incredibly thick and suffocatingly silent. It was the kind of absolute breathless quiet that occurs in a surgical theater right before a highly dangerous incision is made. "Your Honor," David began, his voice projecting clearly across the vast room. "During the original dissolution of this marriage, the respondent submitted a sworn affidavit claiming the marriage suffered an irretrievable breakdown due to the petitioner's, my client's, physical inability to conceive a child. He used this specific, heavily publicized narrative to justify an expedited divorce and to manipulate the division of our mutual assets, claiming immense emotional distress. He publicly stated on the permanent legal record that his deep desire for biological fatherhood forced him to seek a life elsewhere." David walked over to the court clerk and handed over the authenticated medical document we had recovered from the hidden digital server. "We submit into evidence petitioner's Exhibit 14, a certified, verified medical diagnostic report from a private urological specialist dated 5 full years before the respondent ever filed his sworn affidavit. This document definitively proves that the respondent Julian was diagnosed with severe, irreversible, and permanent genetic sterility. He knew with absolute scientific certainty that he was physically incapable of fathering a child long before he blamed my client for their fertility struggles. He committed blatant, calculated perjury to publicly humiliate his wife and obscure his financial fraud." The silence in the courtroom shattered instantly. It was not a loud uproar, but a frantic, aggressive whispering that swept through the gallery like a violent wildfire. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at the second row. Sarah and Mark, the couple who had hosted Julian and Clara's lavish baby shower, were staring at Julian with expressions of pure, undisguised horror and profound revulsion. The grand illusion of the tragic husband forced to leave a broken woman to find biological happiness was completely destroyed. The curtain had been violently ripped away, exposing a malicious, calculating fraud who had emotionally tortured his wife purely to cover up his own physical inadequacies. They were doing the exact same mental math I had done weeks ago. If Julian was genetically sterile, the golden child he had been parading around town was a complete living lie. The immense weight of the collective realization crushed Julian entirely. His narcissistic shield, carefully constructed over half a decade of pathological lying, violently exploded. He shot up from his heavy wooden chair, his face a terrifying mottled mask of purple rage. He completely ignored his frantic attorneys who were desperately pulling at the sleeves of his expensive suit to force him back down. "This is an absolute outrage," Julian screamed, his voice cracking hysterically, echoing off the high oak ceilings. "Those medical records are completely fabricated. She fabricated them. She is an arrogant, vindictive doctor who manipulated the laboratory results because she is insanely jealous of my new family. She is a barren, miserable woman who wants to destroy the beautiful, perfect life I built. Judge Vance immediately slammed her heavy wooden gavel down the sharp sound, cutting through his frantic screaming. Mr. Respondent, you will sit down and remain completely silent, or I will hold you in direct criminal contempt of this court and have the bailiffs remove you in handcuffs. But Julian was entirely beyond reason. The sheer panic of being publicly exposed, of having his friends look at him with absolute disgust, broke his mind. He pointed a trembling, aggressive finger directly at me. You think you won? You think you are so incredibly smart. You are absolutely nothing. You hear me? You are nothing but a cold, empty machine. Bailiffs! Judge Vance ordered, her voice like a freezing, cracking whip. Restrain the respondent immediately. Two heavily armed, uniformed court officers immediately rushed forward. They grabbed Julian by both of his arms, forcefully shoving him back down into his heavy leather chair. He continued to thrash wildly his polished, perfectly styled hair, falling into his crazed, bloodshot eyes, screaming incoherent insults as his expensive defense attorneys visibly backed away from him in sheer professional embarrassment. The local socialites in the gallery watched the total psychological collapse of the man they had once deeply admired. It was a pathetic, ugly display of a cornered animal realizing there were no more shadows left to hide in. Judge Vance did not even wait for the courtroom to fully settle before delivering her brutal, decisive ruling. Her face was a mask of furious legal authority. I have presided over this court for 2 decades, and I have rarely witnessed such a profound, malicious display of calculated fraud and perjury, she stated, her voice amplified by the microphone. The respondent's behavior is a complete disgrace to the judicial process. I am immediately freezing all domestic and international assets tied to the 3 identified shell corporations. I am awarding the petitioner, Sienna Gray, full restitution of the hidden $800,000, plus punitive damages, and total coverage of all legal fees incurred during this process. Furthermore, I am officially referring the respondent to the District Attorney's Office for a full criminal investigation regarding multiple counts of sworn perjury and severe financial fraud. The final strike of her heavy gavel echoed with ultimate, irreversible finality. The massive legal battle was officially over. Julian was not just financially ruined. He was facing severe criminal charges that would likely result in an extended prison sentence. His reputation was completely incinerated, his fake family was shattered, and his web of lies had become his permanent tomb. As the frantic reporters and shocked spectators began to loudly file out of the sprawling courtroom, buzzing with the scandalous details of the fallen golden boy, I did not join the chaotic frenzy. I stood up slowly from the petitioner's table. I did not pump my fists in the air. I did not turn around to gloat in Julian's completely destroyed, sobbing face as the bailiff stood over him. I simply picked up my leather briefcase and buttoned my suit jacket. Standing there in the quiet corner of the massive room, bathed in the warm, crisp morning sunlight streaming through the towering windows, I realized something profound. I did not feel the dark, fiery thrill of victory I had once expected. I felt something infinitely better. I felt nothing at all for him. He was no longer a towering monster in my mind, nor a source of agonizing pain. He was just a pathetic, broken man facing the inevitable consequences of his own actions. The suffocating heavy chains of the past 5 years simply unraveled and fell completely away. I turned my back on the wreckage of Julian's life and walked calmly toward the exit, finally breathing in the clean, free air of my own future. 6 months after the judge brought the heavy wooden gavel down, my professional life transformed entirely. The board of directors at Zenith Medical Group recognized not just my clinical expertise, but the absolute unshakable grace I had maintained under immense public pressure. I was promoted from head of rehabilitation to the chief medical officer for our entire regional healthcare network. My days were no longer defined by exhausted survival or the bitter weight of the past. Instead, I spent my time actively building programs leading a massive healthcare system and looking solely toward the future. During a crisp Tuesday afternoon, I agreed to meet Clara one final time at a quiet, sunlit coffee shop downtown. It was not a tearful reunion of long-lost friends, nor was it a dramatic, angry confrontation. We sat across from each other with hot ceramic mugs between us, speaking in low, measured tones like two battered survivors standing in the smoldering aftermath of a massive natural disaster. Clara looked entirely different. The expensive designer clothes and the heavy glamorous makeup were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a plain cotton blouse. She informed me that her aggressive divorce proceedings were nearly finalized, and she was moving back to her small hometown with her son to start completely over. "I am sorry, Sienna," Clara said softly, staring down at her black coffee. "I truly am." I looked at her, and for the first time I realized that I did not actually need her apology to move on. I did not need Julian's remorse either. The greatest and most difficult lesson I had learned over the past 2 years was that true healing required forgiving myself. I had to forgive myself for ever believing I was a broken, inadequate woman. I nodded slowly, wishing her well, and we parted ways at the corner of the street, two women finally walking out of the dark shadow of the exact same man. Later that evening, while unpacking boxes in my brand new apartment, I found an old leather-bound photo album tucked away in a cardboard box. I opened the heavy cover and looked at the glossy photographs from my early marriage. I did not feel the familiar agonizing sting of betrayal. Instead, I looked at the younger, naive version of myself with the gentle, deeply appreciative eye of an experienced survivor. I traced the edge of the photograph, feeling incredibly grateful that I had refused to let a fabricated history completely define my existence. As for Julian, he had entirely vanished from my reality. He was no longer the oppressive center of my universe. The local newspapers occasionally printed small updates regarding his ongoing criminal trial. The legal experts predicted he would be facing anywhere from 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary for the massive corporate fraud and the intentional perjury he committed. His wealthy, arrogant facade had completely crumbled into dust, leaving absolutely nothing behind but a spiral of severe consequences. I no longer actively followed the headlines. His ultimate fate simply did not matter to me anymore. I closed the leather album, stood up, and walked out onto the expansive glass balcony of my new home. The cool evening breeze washed over my face as I looked out at the brilliant, glowing skyline of the city. The horizon stretched out endlessly before me, full of infinite possibilities. For a very long time, I had thought the ugly truth about Julian was a weapon I needed to wield to destroy him. But standing there, breathing in the quiet, peaceful night air, I finally understood the reality. The truth was never a weapon at all. It was simply the only key that could ever open the heavy iron door to my absolute liberation. Thank you so much to everyone who tuned in to listen to my story today. I would love to know, where in the world are you listening from right now? Please let me know down in the comments. And if you found today's journey compelling and wish to support our channel, please consider donating just $1. Your generous $1 contribution provides the critical funds we need to pay our hardworking staff, allowing them to support their families and continue bringing you more powerful stories. You can quickly make your donation by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link located in the video description or the pinned comment. Thank you again for your incredible support. Take care of yourselves and have a wonderful day.